Forks of Fate by Edwina Longbottom. The autumn breeze rustled through the nearly empty park as James Harper mechanically unwrapped his turkey sandwich. Same lunch, same bench, same time as every other Wednesday for the past 15 years. He watched the leaves dance across the pathway, their golden brown hues a reminder of yet another year slipping away. At 40, James had mastered the art of routine, his life as predictable as the spreadsheets he spent his days analyzing. The morning's events played through his mind like a worn-out record. Sarah had given him that look again, the one that spoke volumes about their fading connection. Their conversation over breakfast had been a series of practiced movements, like actors performing a tired play. Emily, their 12-year-old, had barely looked up from her phone, responding to his questions about school with monotone grunts that seemed to be the new language of teenagers. 8-year-old Jake had thrown another tantrum about his science project, his frustrated tears mixing with his cereal as Sarah shot James that silent look that said, "Do something about your son." Just another day in the life of James Harper, certified public accountant and master of the mundane. The title felt heavy on his shoulders, weighing him down like the responsibility of all those numbers he juggled daily. He remembered a time when his dreams had been bigger, when his heart had yearned for something more than reconciling balance sheets and preparing tax returns. "Fascinating thing, time," a voice said, cutting through his thoughts like a warm knife through butter. "How it flows in one direction, yet branches like a river delta, each choice creating new streams of possibility." James looked up to find an elderly gentleman standing before him, impeccably dressed in a three-piece suit that seemed to belong to another era. His silver hair was neatly combed back, and his eyes twinkled with an impossible shade of violet that caught the sunlight in ways that made James question his own vision. The man's presence seemed to alter the very air around them, as if reality itself bent slightly in his proximity. "I'm sorry," James said, automatically straightening his posture. There was something about this stranger that commanded attention, despite his gentle demeanor. "Mr. Harper," the man said, pulling out a gold pocket watch from his vest. The timepiece seemed to capture and reflect light in ways that defied physics, its surface rippling like liquid metal. "I believe you've been wondering about the road not taken, about dusty tombs and ancient mysteries, about the life you might have led if courage had won over caution that night 20 years ago." James felt a chill run down his spine, his half-eaten sandwich forgotten in his suddenly trembling hands. He hadn't told anyone his name, yet this stranger spoke it with the familiarity of an old friend. More disturbing still was the reference to thoughts he'd never shared with another soul. "Do I know you?" "Not yet," the man smiled, sitting down beside him with a grace that seemed almost otherworldly. "I'm Mr. Tempest, and I'm here to offer you something rather extraordinary." His voice carried the weight of centuries, though his face showed only the gentlest of wrinkles. "Something you've been dreaming about since you were a young man with a letter in his hands and the world at his feet." James watched, mesmerized, as Mr. Tempest held up the pocket watch. The numerals around its face seemed to shift and dance, telling time in ways that went beyond mere hours and minutes. The longer he stared at it, the more he felt like he could see other possibilities, other lives spinning out like golden threads from each number. 20 years ago," Mr. Tempest continued, his violet eyes reflecting something ancient and knowing, "you received a letter from Professor Anderson about an archaeological expedition to the Valley of the Kings. The professor had seen something in you during your undergraduate studies, a spark, a passion for history that went beyond mere academic interest. He offered you a chance to join his team, to be part of something extraordinary." James's sandwich fell from his numb fingers, landing forgotten on the ground. That decision had been private, something he'd never shared with anyone, not even Sarah. In the darkest hours of the night when sleep eluded him, he would sometimes take out the old letter, now yellow with age, and read those words of possibility one more time. "You spent 3 days considering it," Mr. Tempest went on, his voice gentle, but filled with understanding. 3 days of imagining yourself uncovering the secrets of the past, of making discoveries that would change our understanding of history. But in the end, you chose the safer path. accounting school, and a steady career. A decision made with the head rather than the heart. How could you possibly know that? James whispered, his voice hardly more than a breath. The autumn air seemed colder now, though the sun still shone brightly overhead. I know many things, Mr. Harper. More importantly, I know that decision has haunted you for 2 decades, coloring every choice you've made since. This watch, he held it up again, the metal seeming to pulse with an inner light, can give you the chance to make a different choice, to take the road not taken, to see where courage might have led you. James laughed nervously, the sound hollow even to his own ears. Time travel? That's impossible. Things like that don't happen to accountants who eat turkey sandwiches on park benches. So is a stranger knowing your deepest regrets, yet here we are. Mr. Tempest placed the watch in James's hand. It felt warm, almost alive, like holding a small sun. The metal seemed to sync with his heartbeat, creating a connection that went beyond the physical. The rules are simple, though the implications are anything but. Set the hands to the moment you wish to return to, and press the crown 3 times. But remember, every choice has consequences, and the watch's power is not infinite. Use it wisely, Mr. Harper. Some doors, once closed, cannot be reopened. Before James could respond or ask any of the 1,000 questions swirling in his mind, Mr. Tempest stood and walked away. His departure seemed to distort the very air, his form dissolving into the autumn light like morning mist. James sat there, holding the impossible watch, until his lunch hour was over and reality demanded his return to the office. The afternoon passed in a blur of numbers and client meetings, but James couldn't focus. The watch sat in his briefcase, its presence thrumming through his consciousness like a second heartbeat. Every time he opened Excel, he found himself staring at the cells without seeing them, his mind wandering to sandy deserts and hidden tombs. That evening, as James sat in his home office reviewing quarterly reports, the watch sat on his desk, its presence like a persistent whisper in his mind. The day had gone from bad to worse. Sarah had barely spoken during dinner, still upset about their argument from the morning. The silence between them had grown so familiar it felt like a third person at the table. Emily had asked to sleep over at a friend's house, her voice dripping with teenage disdain when he'd hesitated. "Dad, you never let me do anything," she'd complained, stomping up to her room. "Jessica's parents are way cooler than you." The words had stung more than they should have. Jake had refused to eat his vegetables, leading to another exhausting standoff that ended with him being sent to his room without dessert. His sobs had echoed down the hallway, each one feeling like an indictment of James's parenting skills. Now, sitting in the artificial quiet of his home office, James picked up the watch, its weight somehow both comforting and terrifying. The metal seemed to warm to his touch, the hands glowing softly in the dim light. He thought about that letter from Professor Anderson, remembered the excitement he'd felt reading about the expedition, the promise of adventure, of discovery, of a life less ordinary. He'd chosen security instead, believing it was the responsible choice. "Just look at where responsibility got you," he muttered to himself, fingers tracing the watch's intricate engravings. The patterns seemed to shift under his touch, forming and reforming like living things. His computer screen showed an unfinished spreadsheet, the cursor blinking accusingly in cell B47. 20 years of cells, formulas, and client meetings stretched behind him like a paper trail leading nowhere. Ahead lay 20 more years of the same, unless... Before he could talk himself out of it, James set the hands to that fateful night 20 years ago. His fingers trembled as he remembered Mr. Tempest's instructions. His heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat, he pressed the crown 3 times in quick succession. The world dissolved into golden light. Reality seemed to fold in on itself, time becoming liquid around him. James felt himself being pulled apart and reassembled, his consciousness stretching across decades like taffy before snapping back into place. When his vision cleared, James found himself standing in his old apartment, the letter from Professor Anderson spread out on his desk. The familiar scent of instant coffee and textbooks filled the air. A Dave Matthews Band poster hung on the wall, the same one his college roommate had given him, which had been lost in one of his many moves over the years. His reflection in the window showed a face unmarked by 2 decades of compromise and routine. No gray hairs at his temples, no worry lines around his eyes. He was 20 again, standing at the crossroads that had defined his life. "Oh my God," he whispered, touching his smoother face. It actually worked. The letter before him was exactly as he remembered it, Professor Anderson's enthusiastic handwriting spilling across the page. The professor described the expedition in vivid detail, the possibility of discovering untouched tombs in a previously unexplored section of the Valley of the Kings, the chance to be part of history. The original James had written a polite rejection, choosing instead to accept an internship at Wilson & Associates accounting firm. This time, with trembling hands, James wrote a different letter. His pen moved across the paper with purpose, accepting the professor's offer. As he wrote, he felt the future shifting around him, reality reshaping itself to accommodate his new choice. The next few months passed in a whirlwind of preparation and excitement. Instead of memorizing tax codes, James studied hieroglyphics and archaeological techniques. Rather than learning about depreciation schedules, he learned about carbon dating and preservation methods. His parents were bewildered by his sudden change of plans, but something in his eyes, a spark of life they hadn't seen in years, kept them from objecting too strongly. The expedition itself exceeded every dream young James had ever had. Landing in Cairo felt like stepping into another world. The heat hit him like a physical force as he stepped off the plane, the air thick with the scent of spices and diesel fuel. The city was a sensory overload. Ancient mosques rising above modern buildings, the call to prayer echoing across crowded streets where luxury cars competed with donkey carts for space. Professor Anderson met them at the hotel, his weathered face bright with excitement. "Welcome to the hunt," he said, clapping James on the shoulder. "Ready to make history?" The international team consisted of archaeologists and specialists from a dozen countries. Among them was Isabella Martinez, a brilliant historian whose expertise in New Kingdom hieroglyphics was matched only by her fierce passion for preservation. She approached each artifact as if it were telling a story, her dark eyes lighting up as she translated ancient texts. "Look at this," she said to James one day, pointing to a series of hieroglyphs they'd uncovered. "This isn't just writing. It's a love letter from 3,000 years ago. Someone stood right here, missing someone they loved, and carved their feelings into stone. History isn't just about kings and wars, James. It's about people, just like us, trying to leave their mark on the world." The work was physically demanding and mentally challenging. Days started before dawn to avoid the worst of the heat and ended long after sunset. James's hands grew calloused from careful excavation work, his skin tanned despite the layers of sunscreen. But every blister, every sunburn, every aching muscle felt like a badge of honor. Their first major discovery came 3 months into the expedition. James was working in a promising section they'd identified through ground-penetrating radar when his brush struck something different. Hours of careful excavation revealed an untouched tomb entrance, sealed for over 3 millennia. "Nobody has seen this since the ancient Egyptians sealed it," Professor Anderson breathed, his hand trembling as he documented the undisturbed cartouche above the entrance. "This is history in the making, people." The tomb belonged to a minor royal family member, but its preservation was extraordinary. Wall paintings depicted scenes from Egyptian daily life in vibrant colors that looked almost fresh. Grave goods filled the chambers, jewelry, furniture, containers still sealed with their original contents. Each item they cataloged added another piece to the puzzle of ancient Egyptian life. As James immersed himself in his new life, the watch remained a constant presence in his pocket. Late at night, when the desert wind howled around his tent and the stars blazed overhead with impossible brightness, he would take it out and wonder about the life he'd left behind. Eventually, the temptation became too strong to resist. The first time he used the watch to check on his original timeline, he found himself standing invisible in his old living room, watching Sarah help Emily with her homework. His daughter's face was scrunched in concentration as she worked through a math problem, looking so much like him that it made his heart ache. Sarah looked tired but peaceful, different somehow from the woman he'd left behind. As months passed in his new life, he continued these brief visits to his old timeline. He watched Sarah meet Michael, a literature professor who shared her love of classic films. He saw the gentle way Michael drew Emily out of her shell, discussing books with her for hours. He witnessed Jake's excitement when Michael taught him to play chess, the game becoming their special ritual every Sunday afternoon. Each visit left James with complicated emotions that he buried himself in work to avoid confronting. The archaeological life suited him more than he'd ever imagined. His natural attention to detail, honed by years of accounting studies in his original timeline, made him exceptional at documenting and cataloging finds. Professor Anderson increasingly relied on him for the most delicate excavation work. "You have a gift," Isabella told him one evening, as they sat outside their tents under a star-filled desert sky. The Milky Way stretched above them like a river of light, more brilliant than James had ever seen it in his city-bound life. "The way you handle the artifacts, it's like you're having a conversation with the past." She passed him a cup of sweet mint tea, their fingers brushing briefly. Unlike Sarah's practical nature, Isabella approached life with passionate intensity. Her dark curls were usually escaping from whatever band tried to contain them, and her notebooks were filled with sketches and poetry alongside archaeological notes. "Sometimes I feel like I don't belong here," James admitted, the tea's warmth spreading through his chest, "like I'm living someone else's life." Isabella's laugh was rich and deep. "Isn't that what archaeology is? Living other people's lives, telling their stories?" She leaned back, gesturing at the stars. "Everyone who ever lived saw these same stars, James. The pharaohs, the slaves who built the pyramids, the priests who wrote the texts we study. We're all connected across time." Her words hit too close to home, and James found himself telling her more than he intended. Not about the watch, but about his doubts, his fears, the feeling that choosing this life meant betraying another. "Life isn't a balance sheet," she said softly, her hand finding his in the darkness. "It's not about debits and credits, profits and losses. It's about following your heart, even when it leads you down unexpected paths." Their relationship grew naturally, like a flower turning toward the sun. Isabella's passion for life was infectious, drawing James out of his shell. She taught him to dance salsa under the desert stars, introduced him to spicy Egyptian street food that made his eyes water, and showed him how to see beauty in the smallest archaeological fragments. Yet even as he fell deeper into this new life, his visits to the original timeline continued. He saw Sarah and Michael's wedding, a small garden ceremony where Emily was the bridesmaid and Jake proudly carried the rings. He watched his children grow and change, Emily discovering photography, Jake joining the school science club. They were happy, he realized, different from how he'd imagined their lives would be, but happy nonetheless. Their biggest archaeological breakthrough came 3 years into the expedition. Deep in a previously unexplored valley, they discovered a tomb complex that changed their understanding of ancient Egyptian funeral practices. The find made international headlines, and suddenly James found himself being interviewed by archaeological journals and documentary crews. Dr. Harper, they called him now, and each time he heard it, he felt a mixture of pride and imposter syndrome. This was supposed to be someone else's life, wasn't it? But the most significant discovery came during the tomb's excavation. In a sealed chamber, they found a collection of papyrus scrolls that had survived the millennia intact. Isabella's hands trembled as she began the translation. "It's a story," she said, her voice filled with wonder, "about a priest who was given the power to change fate by the gods. He could move between different lives, different choices." She looked up at James, her eyes shining. But in the end, he learned that the real magic wasn't in changing his fate, but in understanding it. James felt the watch grow heavy in his pocket. That night, he dreamed of Sarah and Isabella, of balance sheets and hieroglyphics, of parallel lives running like rivers side by side. He woke to find Isabella watching him, her face serious in the pre-dawn light. "You've been carrying a weight," she said simply. "I've seen it in your eyes since the day we met. Whatever it is, James, it's time to let it go or embrace it. You can't live between worlds forever." Her words echoed in his mind as they worked that day, carefully documenting another chamber of the tomb complex. when a support beam suddenly gave way, sending ancient stones crashing down. James found himself trapped in a narrow chamber, the air growing thin as hours passed. In the darkness of the collapsed chamber, with dust filling his lungs and the weight of centuries pressing down around him, James finally faced the truth he'd been running from. The watch felt like it was burning in his pocket, offering escape. He could use it now, return to his safe accounting job, pretend none of this had ever happened. But as his oxygen dwindled and memories flooded his mind, he realized he didn't want to escape. He thought about Emily's smile when she was small, the way she used to run to him after preschool. He remembered Jake's first steps, taken between his outstretched arms, Sarah's face on their wedding day, full of hope and love, then Isabella's laugh echoing across the desert, her passion for life that had awakened something long dormant in his soul. "James!" Isabella's voice cut through the darkness, accompanied by the sound of careful digging. "Hold on, we're coming for you." When they finally reached him hours later, James was barely conscious. Isabella's face was streaked with dirt and tears as she helped pull him from the rubble. That night, as he lay in the medical tent with an oxygen mask on his face, she stayed by his side, her hand firmly in his. "I thought I'd lost you," she whispered. "And I realized there's so much I don't know about you, James. So many shadows behind your eyes." Maybe it was the near-death experience, or maybe it was simply time, but James found himself telling her everything about the watch, his other life, the choice he'd made. He expected disbelief, perhaps even anger, but Isabella listened with the same careful attention she gave to ancient texts. "I always sensed there was something you were running from," she said when he finished, holding his dust-covered hands in hers. "But maybe what you really needed wasn't to escape your old life, but to understand what made it valuable." She touched the watch gently. "This isn't just about choosing between two lives, James. It's about understanding who you are in both of them." That night, James used the watch one last time to check on his family. He found himself in a high school auditorium, watching Emily's graduation. She stood at the podium delivering the valedictorian speech, her voice strong and confident. Sarah sat in the front row, tears of pride in her eyes, her hand clasped with Michael's. Jake, now a teenager, recorded the whole thing, on his phone, occasionally wiping his own eyes when he thought no one was looking. "Life isn't about the paths we don't take," Emily was saying to her graduating class. "It's about finding the courage to walk the path we're on with our whole hearts." James felt tears rolling down his cheeks as he watched his daughter, so grown up, so wise beyond her years. They had moved on, built a new life that didn't include him. And maybe that was okay. Maybe some gifts came with the price of letting go. Mr. Tempest's words came back to him. The watch's power is not infinite. James understood now that he had one final choice to make: stay in this exciting but incomplete life, or return to his original timeline and try to build something better with the family he'd left behind. With tears in his eyes, he said goodbye to Isabella the next morning. They stood among the ancient stones they'd uncovered together, the rising sun painting the desert gold. "You helped me find myself," he told her, "but now I need to find my way home." She kissed him softly, tasting of salt and sand. "Some treasures," she whispered, "are meant to stay buried in the past, precious but untouched. Go be happy, James Harper." One final press of the watch's crown, and James found himself back in his home office, the quarterly reports still spread across his desk. Only seconds had passed in this timeline, but he felt the weight of years lived differently. "Dad?" Jake's voice came from the doorway. "I'm sorry about dinner. Can you help me with my science project?" James looked at his son, really looked at him, seeing both the child he was and the young man he would become. The same curious eyes that had once studied chess moves with another man in another timeline. "Of course, buddy. Let's figure it out together." Over the following months, James worked to rebuild what he'd nearly lost. He talked to Sarah, really talked to her about their dreams and fears. They started marriage counseling, learning to rediscover each other. He took Emily phone-free walks, letting her teach him about her world, delighting in her passionate opinions about everything from climate change to contemporary art. The accounting job remained, but it became just one part of his life rather than its definition. He started taking his family on weekend archaeology trips, teaching them about local history and the thrill of discovery. He volunteered at the city museum, sharing his passion for the past in a way that fit with his present. One day, Sarah found him in his study, looking at their family photo. "You've changed," she said, wrapping her arms around him from behind. "These past few months, it's like you've become more yourself somehow." James smiled, his hand resting on the pocket watch that sat silent now on his desk. "I just needed to take a different path to appreciate the one I was already on." That weekend, as he helped Jake build a model of an Egyptian pyramid for his science project, James caught a glimpse of Mr. Tempest through the window, standing on their suburban street. The mysterious man tipped his hat, violet eyes twinkling, before fading away into the autumn afternoon. Life, James had learned, wasn't about finding the perfect path. It was about walking your chosen path with an open heart, about finding adventure in the everyday moments, and about recognizing that sometimes the greatest treasures aren't buried in ancient tombs, but in the living rooms of ordinary homes, where children laugh and families grow together. The pocket watch remained on his desk, a reminder that sometimes you have to get lost to find your way home. And on quiet evenings, when the light hit it just right, James could almost see other lives, other possibilities, shimmering in its golden surface. Not with regret now, but with gratitude for the life he'd chosen to live. The end.